Imagine the deafening silence of four throttled-back engines. A 25-ton Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, laden with fuel fumes and the weary tension of 10 airmen, drifts out of the thick English cloud base. Below them is not the long, welcoming concrete runway of their base at RAF Bassingbourn. There are no flashing flare paths, no ground crew in sight. There is only the patchwork quilt of the Suffolk countryside, a maze of hedgerows, narrow lanes, and the soft, churned earth of a sugar beet field. The fuel gauges have been trembling on empty for the last 20 minutes. The pilot knows he has one chance. One chance to set this massive machine down without its wheels, without power, and walk away. What happened next would become a legendary feat of airmanship and a masterclass in battlefield recovery. The date is October 10, 1943. The strategic air war over Europe hangs in a delicate balance. The United States 8th Air Force is pushing deeper into Germany by daylight, battering industrial cities and aircraft factories. But the cost is horrific. For every fortress that returns to its English base, another limps back with dead and wounded aboard, its skin riddled with flak. On this day, the crew of Sir Baboon Magoon, a B-17F assigned to the 324th Bombardment Squadron, 91st Bomb Group, is returning from a grueling mission deep into enemy territory. They have battled thick flak over the target and harried the German fighters that stalk them like wolves. But as the English Channel slips beneath them, a new enemy emerges not from the sky, but from within: fuel starvation. The pilot, whose name is lost to history but whose skill would soon be tested to its absolute limit, faces a commander's worst nightmare. The lives of his 9 crewmen depend entirely on the next 60 seconds of his life. To understand the terror of that moment, we must understand the machine they flew. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a legend forged in fire. With a wingspan of over 103 feet and a maximum takeoff weight pushing 65,000 pounds, it was a massive, four-engine beast. Designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, it was packed with .50 caliber machine guns and could carry a bomb load of up to 8,000 pounds. But it was also a machine of intricate systems, dependent on high-octane fuel to keep its Wright Cyclone engines roaring. When those engines fell silent, the B-17 ceased to be a fortress. It became a 25-ton glider with the aerodynamics of a brick. The 91st Bomb Group, based at Bassingbourn, was one of the elite units of the 8th Air Force. They were tasked with precision bombing in broad daylight, a doctrine that demanded courage bordering on madness. On the morning of October 10th, the crew of Sir Baboon Magoon had prepped for what they thought was another standard sortie. They climbed into their fortress, decorated with nose art of a character from Al Cap's Lil Abner comic strip, unaware that their name would soon be etched into aviation history for a reason other than combat. The mission itself was a success. They had formed up with the group, fought their way to the target, and dropped their bombs. But the long flight back, battling headwinds and nursing damaged engines, had devoured their fuel reserve at an alarming rate. As they crossed the English coast, the low-fuel warning lights began to flicker on the instrument panel, angry red eyes staring back at the pilot. One by one, the engines coughed and sputtered. The crew, cramped in their positions, felt the subtle change in vibration, the sickening lurch as power bled away. The intercom crackled with terse, professional reports. Number 3 is losing manifold pressure. Number 2 is running rough. They were running on fumes, and fumes were not going to get them the 60 miles to Bassingbourn. The pilot made the split-second decision that saved their lives. He would not risk ditching in the cold, choppy waters of the North Sea, a death sentence for most airmen who survived a landing on the waves. He would aim for the green fields of England, praying for a flat patch large enough to accept his crippled bird. Little did he know, the field he was about to choose would test the limits of his skill and the resilience of the B-17 airframe to the breaking point. By 1400 hours, the situation inside the cockpit was critical. The pilot, his voice steady but urgent, ordered the crew to assume crash positions. The radio operator sent out a desperate mayday, giving their approximate position over Suffolk. Below them, the landscape scrolled past, a terrifyingly close patchwork of brown and green. The pilot spotted it, a large, relatively flat field near the village of Tannington. It was a sugar beet field, and from the air, it looked soft and muddy, a potential trap that could flip the plane or tear it apart. But it was their only option. He had no time to circle, no time to assess the terrain for ditches or fences. This was it. The pilot executed a maneuver that defied the manuals. He knew that if he lowered the flaps fully, he would lose the precious lift he needed to glide those last few hundred yards. If he didn't lower them enough, his sink rate would be catastrophic. He held the massive Fortress just above stall speed, the controls feeling sloppy and heavy in his hands. The crew braced themselves. In the nose, the bombardier and navigator pulled themselves away from the plexiglass, wrapping their arms around their heads. In the waist section, the gunners sat back-to-back on the floor, their feet planted against the bulkheads. The ball turret gunner was in the most vulnerable position, curled up in the fetal position in the center of the fuselage, knowing that if the plane cartwheeled, his chances were zero. The field rushed up to meet them. The pilot held the nose up in a perfect stall landing attitude. For a heart-stopping moment, the B-17 seemed to hang in the air, suspended just 10 feet above the beat tops. Then came the impact. It was not a smooth touchdown, but a violent, wrenching lurch. The aircraft slammed into the soft earth with a deafening screech of tearing metal. The landing gear, still retracted, was ripped from its mounts. The fuselage slid along the ground, plowing a deep furrow in the dark soil. Inside, the crew was thrown against their restraints. Loose equipment, helmets, flak jackets, ammunition cans became deadly projectiles flying through the fuselage. The sound was apocalyptic, the grinding of aluminum against frozen mud, the snapping of wing roots, the shattering of plexiglass. And then silence. An eerie, profound silence, broken only by the ticking of hot engines and the hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid. The pilot sat in his seat for a second, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was alive. He looked out his side window. He could see dirt and beetroot plants. He wasn't supposed to see that from the cockpit. He was on the ground. They were down. The crew began to stir, calling out their positions, confirming they were all in one piece. Miraculously, not one of the 10 men aboard was seriously injured. Scrapes, bruises, and shattered nerves, but they could walk. As they scrambled out of the escape hatches, they stood in the middle of a farmer's field in Suffolk, staring at the massive, silver shape of their B-17, which lay in the mud like a beached whale. It was battered, bruised, and very, very stuck. Word spread quickly through the local villages. Within hours, Home Guard units and curious locals gathered at the edge of the field. The RAF and USAF sent recovery teams to assess the damage. Their initial verdict was grim. The B-17 was a write-off. It was sitting in the middle of a field, a quarter-mile from the nearest hard road. Its fuselage was twisted, its belly torn open, its propellers bent backward like twisted spoons. The standard procedure for a crash like this was simple. Strip it of anything useful, guns, radios, instruments, and leave the hulk for the salvage crew to cut up for scrap aluminum. The war was too young, and losses too high, to spend weeks recovering one bent airplane when factories were churning out new ones. But the engineers from the 91st Bomb Group saw something else. They saw a challenge. Here was a relatively new B-17F, a valuable asset, lying in a soggy field, largely intact. The question was posed, could it be saved? The initial inspections were discouraging. The landing gear was a tangled mess. The number 3 and 4 engines had ingested mud and beetroot debris, seizing them solid. The lower turret was crushed. But the main wing spar, the backbone of the aircraft, appeared to be intact. The recovery officer on the scene, likely a major from the engineering section, made a decision that flew in the face of conventional wisdom. They would attempt the impossible. They would pull this 25-ton bird out of the mud, repair it in the field, and fly it out. The decision was made, but the obstacles were staggering. First, they had to get to the plane. The field was soft, and the recent autumn rains had turned it into a quagmire. Heavy recovery vehicles would sync up to their axles trying to approach. Second, they had to lift the plane. To repair the landing gear and engines, the B-17 had to be off the ground. But how do you jack up a 25-ton bomber on soft soil? The plan that emerged was audacious. It would require heavy timbers, aircraft jacks, sheer manpower, and a lot of ingenuity. Pause. For the next several weeks, the quiet village of Tannington would become an impromptu aircraft factory as American GIs and British civilians worked side by side in the cold, damp October air. The first crisis was access. A temporary road had to be built across the field to the crash site. Engineers laid down lengths of steel tracking, known as Marsden matting, creating a path that could support the weight of trucks and cranes. Even with the matting, vehicles would frequently slide off into the mud, requiring tractors to pull them free. The weather, always an enemy in England, refused to cooperate. Low clouds and persistent drizzle turned the recovery site into a sea of mud. Men worked in slicker suits, their hands numb with cold, struggling with heavy wrenches and frozen bolts. Next came the monumental task of lifting the fortress. The recovery team brought in heavy-duty hydraulic jacks, the kind used to lift locomotives. But you can't put a jack on mud. They had to construct massive wooden cribbing platforms, log cabin-style stacks of heavy timbers, to distribute the weight. They placed these cribs under the strong points of the wing and the forward fuselage. Then, inch by agonizing inch, they began to pump the jacks. The massive B-17 groaned and creaked, protesting as it was lifted from its muddy grave. The tension was palpable. If the cribbing shifted or sank, the plane would crash back down, likely breaking its back and killing anyone standing nearby. It took days of painstaking work just to get the hulk high enough to lower the damaged landing gear. With the plane finally on its own wheels, the true extent of the damage was visible. The engines were a disaster. Mud had packed into the cowlings and frozen around the cylinders. The propellers were bent into useless shapes, their blades curled back from the impact. The lower turret was a wreck. The belly of the plane, from the radio room back to the tail, was scraped and torn, with gaping holes where the aluminum skin had been peeled away by the frozen ground. Standard procedure demanded the plane be scrapped. But the engineers were stubborn. They decided to replace the damaged parts on site. This presented a logistical nightmare. How do you replace an engine on a B-17 in the middle of a field? They had to bring in a crane, again navigating the treacherous mud field. A replacement engine had to be trucked in from a depot, carefully lifted and maneuvered into the mounts. The new propellers had to be hoisted up and fitted to the crankshafts. The men working on the plane were not factory mechanics, they were combat crew ground staff, used to working on hard stands in a rush to get planes back into the air. Here, they worked in the open, exposed to the elements, with no heated hangar, no proper lighting. They worked by day, and when darkness fell, they worked by the glare of portable floodlights powered by generators. As November arrived, the weather turned even colder. Frost covered the wings each morning, delaying work until the sun could thaw the surfaces. The men knew that the longer they took, the harder the job became. They were also aware of the scrutiny. High Command was watching this unorthodox experiment. If it failed, it would be a massive waste of resources. If it succeeded, it would prove that damaged bombers could be salvaged from almost anywhere. The pressure was immense. The pilot and crew of Sir Baboon Magoon had long since been reassigned to other duties, flying new planes on new missions. But the ground crew remained, fighting their own private battle against the mud, the cold, and the skeptics. Pause, and then, after weeks of brutal labor, they reached the final, most daunting hurdle, getting it out. By late November, the plane was as repaired as it could be in the field. The new engines had been run up, their roar shattering the silence of the Suffolk countryside, sending birds fleeing from the hedgerows. The temporary patches had been riveted into place, sealing the holes in the fuselage. Sir Baboon Magoon, battered but alive, sat at the edge of the field, pointed toward the only possible exit. But there was no runway. The recovery team had one final trick up their sleeves. They would build one. Engineers laid down an 1,800-foot-long strip of pierced steel planking directly in front of the aircraft. This makeshift runway, barely long enough for a fully loaded B-17, stretched across the sugar beet field, its metal surface gleaming dully under the gray November sky. The question now was, could a pilot actually do it? Taking off an AB-17 required speed, power, and precision. The aircraft needed to reach 90 to 100 miles per hour to generate enough lift to break the surly bonds of gravity. On a concrete runway, that was routine. On a steel mat laid on soft mud, with a hedge and a ditch at the end, it was a suicide run. The pilot selected for this mission was not one of the original crew, but a veteran test pilot from the Air Service Command, a man named Lieutenant Harold R. Hal Taft. He arrived at the site, walked the length of the makeshift runway, and studied the plane. He knew that if he didn't get airborne in those 1,800 feet, he would be a fireball at the end of the field. On the morning of the attempted takeoff, the tension was electric. A crowd gathered at a safe distance, the ground crew who had spent weeks on the project, curious locals, RAF officers, and USAF brass. Taft climbed into the cockpit. He went through his checklist, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar instruments of this repaired stranger. He started the engines one by one, the roar building to a thunderous crescendo. He released the brakes. The B-17 lurched forward, its massive weight pressing down on the steel matting. The takeoff roll began, agonizingly slow at first. Taft kept the plane glued to the deck, building speed. The end of the runway rushed toward him. The crowd held their breath. At the very last moment, with the hedgerow filling his windscreen, Taft pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted. The main wheels left the matting. The bomber staggered into the air, its wings straining, its engines at full military power. It cleared the hedge by mere feet. It was flying. The ground crew erupted in cheers. Hats were thrown into the air. The impossible had been achieved. Sir Baboon Magoon circled once over the field, a final salute to the men who had refused to let it die, before turning toward the maintenance depot. It landed safely, was given a full overhaul, and returned to the 91st Bomb Group at Bassingbourn on February 19, 1944. The sugar beet field had released its captive. The story of that audacious recovery spread throughout the 8th Air Force. It was featured in the June 1944 issue of Popular Science magazine and later in Flying magazine, a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the men who kept the bombers flying. The article detailed how the plane was jacked up, repaired, and flown out, a morale-boosting story of American know-how in the face of adversity. For the men on the ground, it was proof that their work mattered, that a crippled warbird was not just scrap, but a weapon that could be returned to the fight. But the legacy of Sir Baboon Magoon was not yet complete. After its resurrection, it flew 7 more missions from Bassingbourn. The crew who flew it noted it was a real crate, covered in patches and quirks from its ordeal. On March 29, 1944, on a mission to Brunswick, Germany, fate caught up with it. A bomb dropped by a bomber flying above struck its number 4 engine. With damaged hydraulics, a windmilling prop, and open bomb bay doors, it fell out of formation. Attacked by fighters, it limped over the North Sea. With darkness approaching and the English coast still 90 miles away, the pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Edgar C. Downing, pulled his crew. They chose to ditch in the dark, cold sea. Against all odds, Downing executed a perfect ditching. The entire 10-man crew escaped into life rafts. They drifted for over 5 hours in 5-foot waves, launching flares into the night sky until a German E-boat, responding to the distress signal, picked them up. They spent the remainder of the war as prisoners in Stalag 17B. The B-17, Sir Baboon Magoon, slipped beneath the waves of the North Sea, 28 nautical miles northwest of IJmuiden. The plane that had been saved from a muddy field in Suffolk met its end in the saltwater, but its crew lived. The skill of the pilot who ditched it, a technique later adopted as standard procedure, saved those 10 men. The story of the plane and its crew is a microcosm of the air war, survival, loss, ingenuity, and the thin line between life and death. The recovery of Sir Baboon Magoon from a Suffolk sugar beet field remains one of the most remarkable stories of battlefield salvage of the Second World War. It is a testament not only to the skill of the pilots who flew these machines, but to the unsung heroes on the ground, the mechanics, engineers, and airmen who worked in freezing mud and driving rain to give a bomber a second chance at life. Their determination kept planes in the sky and crews in the fight. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.